Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. First of all, let me introduce myself. My name is Wardarina from Asia Pacific Forum on Women, Law and Development, now talking to you from Chiang Mai, Thailand. And then we are also the co-chairs of Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism. On behalf of the other co-organizers, we have Civil Society Financing for Development, FFD Group. We have the APRCEM, or the Asia Pacific Regional CSO Engagement Mechanism, Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration, ETC Group, and then also the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD. All of us, we would like to welcome all of you in this very important spotlight session with the title of Bridging the Gap, Addressing the Vacuum in Multilateral Governance of Digital Technology to Close the Digital Divide and Support Efforts to Leave No One Behind. So, this is a very important session. And then we actually just also want to give some context a little bit what actually we have learned from this multidimensional COVID-19 crisis. We learned that the global COVID-19 pandemic has exposed the extent and also further exacerbate the digital divide, the ever widening gap in access to digital technology and infrastructure between the North and the South, between men and women across the world, and between urban and rural communities within countries. And then as the digital gap is widening and worsening as a result of the pandemic, the world on both sides of the divide have to deal with a lot of consequences. And then we can see it very clearly. We see a range of violation of basic rights, especially of women, girls, and young people. We see racial and gender discrimination. We see breach of privacy and cybersecurity attacks to repression and manipulation and highly imbalanced power and influence of technology platforms and companies. So in the next 45 minutes, I'm going to stop talking now because in the next 45 minutes, we will listen mostly from our 4 incredible speakers that we have and line up for you here that we have in the panel. I will introduce them, don't worry, when I ask them the question. And then please kindly be reminded, panelists, that you have 5 minutes to deliver your remarks so we can have more time later on to discuss, a little bit more. So in the first question that I want to ask all of the panelists, and then this is in the first 20 minutes, I would like to ask to all the panelists, how do we look at this issue of digital divide? And then what does inequality really look like from your perspective? Yeah. So I'm just going to check here. Oh, that's great. I already have my first speaker is already there. That's great. Clovis, I'm going to call on you, Clovis. And then I'm just going to just give me a sec. So I want to ask you a question, Clovis. Clovis, you are currently working in Division on Technology and Logistics of the United Nations Conference on Trade and Development, or UNCTAD, and also coordinate and was the lead author of the Technology and Innovation Report 2021. So can you give us a little bit of insight from you on this digital divide and inequalities that it causes? So Clovis, I'm going to give it to you.
Oh, thank you very much, Vadarina. And good morning, good afternoon, good evening, all participants. And thank you again for being part of this very important discussion. And Vadarina, as you were mentioning, the COVID-19 pandemic has shown us the critical role of digital technology in so many areas. But the pandemic also exposed digital divides. But before we go there, let me start by making the point that there has been great progress in the deployment and access to digital technology so far. As you know, mobile cellular signals now reach more than 95% of the global population. It is estimated that more than 50% use the internet. But we know that these are unequally available within and across countries with large digital divides, as you mentioned, particularly on the access to the internet, access to digital equipment, technology. For example, the proportion of people using the internet in developed countries is more than 4 times that in the least developed countries. Affordability is a barrier to access for many people. fixed and mobile broadband price exceed 20% of average gross national income per capita in 9 least developed countries. To give an idea, in many developed countries, the price is as low as 2%. A key issue is also the divide related to gender. On average, women are 17% less likely than men to use the internet. The gap ranged from 3% in developed countries to 43% in least developed countries. So what is critical to note that these digital divides result from social and economic inequalities that already exist across and within countries. And in their turn, they reinforce existing inequalities, is in this vicious circle. So technical solutions using digital technologies, we know that they can benefit marginalized groups and those that are further behind, but they can also help even more those that already have an advantage in several social and economic dimensions. As new digital technologies are developed and the digital and physical world gets more connected, digital and social inequalities will become more and more the same. We need to address social and digital inequalities at the same time. Now, let me turn to my second point that I would like to highlight, is that it's critical to see that there is not one, but two waves of digital transformation right now. One is this digital revolution, this wave that at its peak in developed countries, and we are seeing now a major push for digitalization and e-commerce in developing countries. And to put it in perspective, UNCTAD estimates that in 2019, the value of e-commerce was over $26 trillion, and there was about 1.5 billion people shopping online. The other wave of technological change is based on technologies like artificial intelligence, robotics, Internet of Things, and other technologies associated with Industry 4.0. This wave is still in very early stages. Of course, there is, we have estimated that suggests that these technologies already represent a $350 million market, and that by 2025 could grow to over 3.2 trillion. But the issue is that for many people in developing world, these technologies are really, really far away. So it's critical to understand the effect of these technological revolutions, because every wave of technological progress since the Industrial Revolution was associated with sharper inequality across countries. Before 1800, there was very little income disparities between countries. Inequality was a matter of domestic class divides. But today, the average gap in per capita income between developed and developing countries is over $40,000. So inequality today is driven by the lottery of the birthplace. A person born in a poor country suffer this citizen penalty. So to give an idea, in upper middle income and high income countries, the average share of the population living in extreme poverty is less than 2%. But in lower middle income countries, and it's 14%. And in low income countries can be over 45% living in extreme poverty. So in summary, the root causes of digital divides are in the social and economic divides. And we have to tackle both at the same time, the digital and the social-economic divides. And we have to be mindful of the effects of the technological waves, because they can help countries to catch up and close gaps, but they also may risk increasing those gaps. I'll stop here.
So much for that, Clovis, and also for being timely for your intervention. And then I think that I take notes on what you said, that we need to address the social and digital inequalities at the same time. That is what you've been saying. And then you give a very good overview of the two waves of the digital transformation, and then how it actually, reach developing countries in really uneven manner, like it's sort of like with delays and then bits and pieces and etc. And then so really, really appreciate of what you're saying. So I'm going to go now to the other speakers. Thank you so much again, Clovis. I am going to ask the same question to Soledad from Action Group on Erosion, Technology and Concentration. or the ETC group. Soledad, I'm very much inspired to read your bio. You have many years of experience working with indigenous movements, to defense of the territories, biodiversity and rights. You also work with the trade union before and cooperatives in agri-food sectors. And now you're in ETC. You work a lot and coordinating, on the issue of digitalization of the food system. And then really its impact to peasant and then farmers, like small land farmers. From that backdrop, and then also adding from what Clovis mentioned, can you share with us how do you look at this issue of digital divide and what does inequality really look like from your perspective?
Sure, and thank you so much for this invitation. Really, what we are trying to look at from ETC Group is to understand how we could analyze this divide from the perspective of understanding power behind this. I think it's a very, very strong issue to understand that in 2008, the world's most powerful corporations drilled oil wells and traded stocks. And now, 12 years later, the world's 5 corporate titans all deal in intangible data and have a market valuation that exceeds the GDP of entire continents. So we have seen an enormous shift of where capital is to digital technologies. So when we talk about the digital gap, we are also talking about a very important source of interest for companies, and we should understand also what are the power interests that's behind that. For many of us that deal with our smartphones all the time and we use the email, some things look very intangible, no? But we need to understand that this thing that we call the cloud, it's a very concrete material infrastructure of digital storage warehouses around the world, with the capacity to store and exchange the vast quantities of data that we produce every day. And I was reading today that according to Gartner, in 2020, the top 5 data infrastructure providers accounted for 80% of the market. And the one that's leading that, it's Amazon, that owns 41% of the share, following Microsoft, Alibaba, Google, and Huawei. And the amount of data that they manage between these 5 companies is unimaginable. It's more than 1,200 petabytes between them. And we need to understand also that more like traditional commodities, data is made more valuable by processing it, particularly through what Clovis was talking recently, artificial intelligent algorithms. That's unlike physical commodities that increase value through scarcity, data increases value as more and more is hoarded and aggregated. So the big question to see how useful digital technologies and access are is not who is collecting the data, but more importantly, who is able to analyze the data for their advantage. And there is a great divide in terms of who is benefited by the way in which data today is analyzed and for what objectives. So to understand the structural determinations of the digital divide, we think we must understand that the internet is not immaterial at all, that most of its infrastructure is corporate owned, and that has become one of the sectors with the greatest concentration of all. And with such power concentration, the capacity for developing countries to display sovereign policies for digital access and regulatory control is really strongly challenged. So I'm going to stop there to have time for other inquiries afterwards.
Thank you for that, Soledad, and then for pointing out the structural determination of the digital divide. And then you mentioned a lot of very good points that I took notes here. You talk about power interests. You talk about who able to analyze data and for what benefit. You mentioned also on the power concentration of the corporations on this issue or sector, and then how the capacity for developing countries to display sovereign policy for digital access and also control is actually being challenged right now. I think that it's very, very important. Now I'm going to move to Parminder. Parminder, this is our next speaker from IT for Change. India. I know Parminder quite some time, and then Parminder, you have probably have the longest experience and vast knowledge among the civil society on governance on digitalization, coming from your many years of engagement in the different platform, including the Internet Governance Forum, and then also you led a global project on principles and governance of digitalization at IT for Change. So in any insight from you, Parminder, listening to from Clovis and then Soledad, any other addition that you want to make on this point? Parminder, we cannot hear you, so maybe.
Me now?
Yes,
Can you hear me now?
we can hear you
Okay,
now.
sorry.
Yeah.
So I'll take forward, thanks, Wardarina, and I'll try to take forward the analysis which Clovis and Soledad gave and try to make it even more granular. Long back, I heard this and it stuck with me. Somebody said, no longer you need to worry about finding the network because the network is trying to find you. So this is not to minimize the digital divides of actually people not being able to go on the network, which Clovis talked about, but to now try to see why is the network trying to find you. And that is very important to figure out a new kind of divide which is taking place. Of course, the network is trying to find you to be able to connect you to other people and therefore take the brokerage fee of that connection. You know what network effects, more people are on the network, then there is the monopolization, and the person who's organizing the network develops certain power, which has been called as network power. But I think even that has been superseded. Not only the network is trying to network you, but it is trying to collect data from you. And that's where you talk about data power, that it starts to collect data and accumulate data power. But I think even going forward, we need to understand what is the kind of power which data gives. Data itself is not valuable, and partly Soledad talked about it. It's data's conversion into intelligence which makes it powerful. The network or the network owner is able to use data to develop intelligence about you and me and those people whose data it is. And through that intelligence, it then reorganizes the social, economic, and political activity of that place, those set of actors, that region of whose intelligence it's able to take. And then if you really look at it, Uber does what? Uber takes transportation intelligence of, say, New Delhi, and using that intelligence reorganizes the transportation actors, which is the taxi guys and the commuters. So what is happening here is that some people extract data from other places, convert into intelligence, and use that intelligence then to organize the economic, social, political activity of that place whose data it was. Now, this is the new divide. Those people whose data gets collected are on one side, often in the developing countries. And on the other side are those countries whose corporations, chiefly US, but increasingly also China, are the ones who collect data, convert into intelligence, and use the intelligence again to organize the political, social, and economic activity in that place. And the kind of things which get organized by the intelligence are really like covering almost everything. We talk about Uber, that's the Uberification of everything. It's a perfect example of somebody taking data from the roads of New Delhi or Nairobi, taking it to US, converting into intelligence, and using that intelligence to actually negotiate the relationship between me sitting here in New Delhi with the taxi driver who's just right across the corner. And shift that kind of control to every sector. And there is ex-CEO of Uber who has bought a new company which is trying to organize kitchen space in India. Now, one would think that kitchen space is something very natural. Why couldn't locally people organize it? Why a US company is collecting data of kitchen spaces to develop food delivery systems and organize it from the US? So now the big divide, therefore, is of the people who give their data, whose data gets collected, and those who collect the data, often in other countries, use the intelligence to then orchestrate the economic activity in that place and make most of the money. So what is happening that intelligence owning companies are now superseding in even intellectual property owning companies in global value chains. Waymo, which is the Google sister company in transportation, is becoming more valuable than GM and Ford and all those Toyotas put together. Why it is so? All the IP is with these companies, but Waymo has the transportation intelligence. So I think that is the new divide: whose data gets taken, who converts into its intelligence and concentrates it. And this is an area where the concentration of power is evident, because intelligence has this inherent quality about concentrating in smaller and smaller, fewer and fewer places, which you are actually seeing in front of you is happening in all areas. And I'll come back and talk further about it, what could possibly be done about it. Thank you so much.
Thank you so much, Parminder, for that. And then I think that is very concrete, with example when you mentioned about the data and then the data power, and then you give example of Uber and etc. I really appreciate that. And then also maybe we can actually have more conversation later on what can we do. Yeah. And then now I'm just going to have our last speaker for this part. Our last speaker, but not least, her name is Ruth. Ruth, I hope that you're there. Her name is Ruth Hancock. She is an agroecological farmer and then member also of the Land Workers Alliance. Ruth, you have been, you are as a farmer and also working directly with the other grassroots farmers. What does this digital divide mean to you? And then what is actually the form of inequality that you feel in terms of digital divide?
Yeah. Yes, thank you very much for having me. I'm a representative of the Land Workers Alliance, and through that, Lavie Campesina. So I'm a small-scale peasant farmer in the UK, and this is how I make my living. But yes, I'm very interested in, as all the other speakers have said, about this power divide and the accumulation of power in certain hands. And it seems that with the digital technologies that we have at the moment, in particular the harvesting of data, in many ways it feels as if we're now potentially, rather than being exploited in terms of perhaps we could, in previous times we were sold fertilizers as this is how we're going to operate our farms more efficiently and be more productive. Now, if we use digital technologies, the potential for then that knowledge, that intelligence to then be remade into something that can be sold back to us, which isn't necessarily a bad thing in itself, in that we may have more resources. But the dangers of corporate control, taking advantage and extracting value from our systems, whether that's through extracting profit because they want to get into a market. I personally, and many smaller farmers in the UK now, are mainly making a living because we are selling direct to our customers, which works quite well on a small scale. But there are many digital platforms which are trying to intervene, or there are some digital platforms which will try to intervene and almost like reinventing the wheel of like the supermarkets, where value can be extracted from our food system, or from our food network as we prefer to see it. So the dominant technology, of course, is the one that's first adopted. So here we are talking on Zoom, that will tend to take the market share. So although it may seem to be democratizing to have all these different digital technologies, there will tend to be a consolidation of power. So if we want to develop, we feel that if we want to develop these digital technologies, which potentially can help us on our farm, so long as we're not just being sold a solution that was looking for a problem, then we need to somehow make sure that the ownership and the control, and preferably the development of these digital technologies remains in the hands of the farmer. In the UK, we do have several farmer developed or technologically, say for instance, we have applications where soil health can be monitored, and we can use that very practically on our farms. But that's something that's been developed by the grassroots, so we can use that from the grassroots. And it's we're trying to retain it as an open source resource. And then on top of all those sort of practical issues, which are perhaps not specific to any particular group, then we do have the gender lens, and we have all kinds of other inequalities which are made worse by this digital divide. So, for instance, as a woman, I find it more difficult to access or understand, or even have this confidence that I can use these technologies. And if I feel that as a white Western educated woman, then I think that that's going to be amplified in any other situations where people are already socially disadvantaged. We're going to see that divide becoming worse. So in many ways, I think it's better to focus less on the idea that it's digital technology that's lacking and leaving some communities behind. And as the other speakers have said, we need to address the more systemic disadvantages. As an agroecological farm, issues such as secure access to land, legal agreements, resources, water and seeds, and to an extent secure access to markets. And once that's addressed alongside the digital divide, then we start to get somewhere. But to suggest that the digital divide in itself is a solution to our inequities is really sort of presenting it perhaps as more important than it is. It needs to be taken, as the other speakers say, alongside the systemic disadvantages that we already see and that we already labour under individually and collectively. So yes, that's my that's my assessment of how it feels to be in a system where these digitalized solutions are presented, that sometimes they seem to be missing the point. Thank you.
Yes, and thank you so much for bringing that up, Ruth. And then you mentioned it very clearly. It's not only necessarily about the digital access, but also about how we actually also address the issue of the systemic disadvantages caused by the digital divide. And then I think it's very, very important. And I kind of see the, like some pattern whenever I check my notes and then see what Clovis said, what Soledad said, what Parminder said, and what Ruth said. And then I think there's a lot of it, like repeatedly, one word repeatedly mentioned by them is the word power, right? And then also power interests, power, who has the power, who actually get benefit, and etc., right? So this is something that we know as an issue, on the issue of the inequalities of power, wealth, resources that we have, and then how it also with this digital divide is getting exacerbated. But I also want to hear, from the panelists right now, because we already talked about the challenge and then the very big structural challenge of the issue of power. How do you think that we can address? How do you think, what kind of thing that we need to do to actually address that challenges, right? What are the things that we can actually propose and our key demands to actually address the issue that you mentioned earlier? So I'm going to start again with Clovis. Clovis, you have 5 minutes, and then later I'm going to give it to Soledad. Go ahead, Clovis.
Okay, Wadarina, thanks. I think to address this challenge, we have to understand that the governance of digital technologies, they have evolved in the context of these developed countries that are the core of the digital revolution. So by the interrelation of the firms, the government, civil society organizations in these countries. In countries that are at the core of this current wave of technological revolution, and also the next one of Industry 4.0, new technology deployment in production sectors is, firms, farms, is accompanied by the rollout of the infrastructure, the internet, digital warehouse, and so on, the cloud, changes in consumption patterns, and changes in institutions and governance mechanisms. At the same time, this takes time, but these elements co-evolve together. And usually the institutions and governments, they lag behind, even in developed countries. So once a technological revolution matures, as is the case now with this age of digitalization, financial capital starts to look for new opportunities for higher profits, either by stretching this technological revolution to developing countries or betting in emerging new technological revolution like Industry 4.0. So this creates this sequence of waves of technological change. That is why we see now this push for digitalization in developing countries coming from companies and platforms of developed countries. What Praminda was saying, that the network will find you, this push to find us. The problem is that this technological wave reached developing countries with delay and bits and pieces, as you were saying, Valena. It is not that we have the co-evolution of technology, infrastructure, consumption, and institutions happening at the same time as happening in developed countries. No, the deployment of the infrastructure and changes in consumption patterns, they reach first these developing countries. For example, through smartphones, e-commerce, and so on, the use of platforms. When that happens, this change is usually very fast in relative terms. So it's very difficult for institutions and governance at the national, local, and community level to catch up, to build the capacity and be able to adapt to and influence the pace of change. Many times the principles and patterns of governance are basically imported because they are embedded in the platform themselves. For example, in the way that data security and privacy is dealt with. So to tackle this at the global level, we should seek to set technological change in a path that is more inclusive and sustainable. We need to give direction to the technological change, setting the required institutions, creating the necessary incentives for the emergence of innovations that are ultimately inclusive and sustainable. And to do that, we should use the SDGs to set that strategic direction. We also need governments promoting innovation towards social goals. We need international cooperation tackling unintended consequences of technology that affect all countries. We need civil society driving this required change in behavior in institutions that allow us to get these benefits of new technologies and address also the potential risks. So it's critical that we also support the use and adoption and adaptation and the development of these new technologies in developing countries in their own terms, not importing these terms, but in their own terms. But this is important because developing countries, particularly low-income countries in Sub-Saharan Africa, South Asia, and other regions cannot afford to miss this new wave of technological change. Developing countries, they should be able to rely also on technical and financial supports through international cooperation. And we should have an inclusive debate on that, like we are having here. But developing countries, especially least developed countries, they need to be part of the international debate on how new technologies affect citizens' rights, privacy, data ownership, online security, and especially how they can promote the SDGs as well. I'll stop here, Vadrina.
Great, thank you so much, Clovis. You mentioned a lot of concrete ideas, and then I don't want to repeat that because we also want to actually make sure that we have the time later on for discussion. And then just to remind everyone before I give it to Soledad for the answer, please, if you have any question, any comments for the discussion that we already have right now, please do put it in the chat box so we can actually, answer it if we have the time. I think that we still have some time. Now I'm going to give it to Soledad. Soledad, I think that you heard from Clovis, he mentioned the importance of governance, also mentioned about international cooperation, mentioned about civil society. What is your take on this? And then when we talk about governance, what kind of governance that is needed actually, just so I'm going to give you now the floor.
Okay, so in terms of governance, of course, we have a lot of concerns on how fast the deployment of technologies is happening, and of course, with how limited or no regulation or tech assessment this is happening, and how slow the multilateral sphere is to get onto it. No, just thinking about one of our main issues of preoccupation in ETC, which is food sovereignty. Thinking about FAO, FAO is just starting to discuss the issues on data for food systems, while on the other hand, there's so much vectors on how it promotes everything digital with no reservation, as if no injustices or inequalities or negative impacts could come out of it. And on the other hand, we have a big concern because it is very evident we are seeing an overrepresentation and sometimes inadequate placement of private foundations as policymakers. For example, in the case of the recent food system summits, we could see the Bill and Melinda Gates Foundation side to side with public officials promoting everything digital with an homogeneous positive narrative, which was quite striking. So in the context of how slow and corporate-led regulatory framework seems to be, we believe participatory tech assessment emerges as a really important strategy for civil society for bottom-up governance. We have an experience with technology assessment platforms, we call it TAPS, that bring together CSOs, civil society organizations, movements, and other allies in collectively evaluating the potential impacts of digital technologies or platforms on the environment, on society, economy, culture, etc., and consider alternatives. And we think that this is a very empowering strategy in the context of something that seems to be somehow ungovernable sometimes. Here in Latin America, we have the experience of a platform called TECLA, where civil society and movements have come together to address the potential impacts or opportunities of new technologies, considering different cosmovisions and forms of knowledges, which is also very important because the constituents of end users that can potentially be affected and that may deepen the inequalities that we have been mentioning several times in this conversation are not necessarily all the same. And in the case of our concern towards the digitalization of food system, the diversity of constituents is enormous. So we believe that this idea of bottom-up governance by tech assessment platforms controlled by civil society is a very powerful tool we could take on, and that also becomes a very impactful tool in the case of using the conclusions of TAPS to advocate towards our national governments and the international sphere to actually get to adequate regulations that help us give some sort of direction on how we believe the proper use of technologies should happen. Thanks.
Yes, thank you so much, Soledad. And then I think you mentioned a very concrete best practice that already happened. And then we already have like the bottom-up governance with PAPS, which is like really, controlled by the civil societies and etc. And then I just going to give it now to Parminder, but I also want to ask a question, maybe additional, right? Because this issue of digital divide is actually been mentioned a lot by not only the civil societies, the people's movement, but also within the member states, and then also by the UN. And then there's this recent Our Common Agenda report. The UN Secretary General has proposed the creation of the Global Digital Compact. Maybe I don't know whether that some of the panelists want to share their thoughts about it, and then whether that it is the governance, it is a digital governance, or what kind of digital governance that we actually expect. Is it something that we expect also on that? So Parminder, I'm going to give it to you on your thoughts on this and what do we do now?
Thanks, Vadarina. Yes, so taking on from other speakers, but also what I was telling earlier, that what is happening currently is that a few platform owners use data to convert into intelligence, to reorganize every actor, and they become the brain of the system, and they take up all the value, most of the value. That's what is happening today. And that's what digital economy is. We should also know that most of these platforms work in an international manner. And as UNCTAD report pointed out, that 90% of the capitalization of top 75 platforms is shared just between US and China. Now, since these things work on an international level, the governance has to be international. And that's the biggest problem. Earlier, you were able to do your economic governance at national level and then interconnect through trade deals, etc. But here, congenitally, we have to start at an international level. And the international level governance has to rein in the power of platforms. And therefore, it has to be done through data ownership, AI ownership, and platform regulation. So that's the need. Now, what should be done and what's not happening is what I will devote the rest of my 4 minutes to. So the biggest problem at global level where it is needed is this concept of multi-stakeholderism, which Soledad pointed out to earlier, and it also come to what Vadarina was talking about, the global compact. Now, internet started as a technical infrastructure, and at that time it was considered sensible that corporations and technical experts all get together and decide the standards. Like if you have to decide whether electricity grid works or what are the standards, you'll find the big companies and the scientific community to do it together. So that was fine, and that's where the multi-stakeholder governance started of the internet. But that's long, long back when internet was something with which we connected with one another. Today, the scene is what I just described. The whole world is being reorganized on this new pattern, which I described. Now, governance of this cannot be done in the same manner as the governance of the technical infrastructure was being done. But the powerful interests have been served to keep on using this term called multi-stakeholderism, and even saying that all stakeholders should be on equal footing. So it's very funny to think that it is the platform owners who would govern and tell us what platform regulation should look like. But that's what people are talking about right now. It's like having Bayer Monsanto decide what seed system would be, or Shell, British Petroleum sitting over climate change policy making. But however absurd this looks like, in digital arena, that is what is done, and is done openly. The only governance systems globally are ones in which Googles and Facebooks and Amazons sit almost on an equal seat. And this development is going from bad to worse right now in the name of multi-stakeholderism. Recently, the IGF, which was supposed to be only a discussion forum, which was a good thing to have in a multi-stakeholder fashion, is now getting a new leadership panel to start shaping policies. And this leadership panel would be multi-stakeholder. And very strangely, there are some references where they are connecting to how much funds people can bring. So we are going towards a governance system where the most concentrated power owners ever in history are the ones who will determine governance. So it's kind of going back from democracy to a feudal system. Now I come back that that's not the only possibility. There was a World Summit on Information Society in 2005, which has given a mandate clearly that an intergovernmental platform is needed for internet-related public policies, which means digital policies today. And that mandate has not been fulfilled. There have been two working groups on enhanced cooperation. I was a member of both of them, luckily or unluckily, because they never did anything. And they kept on actually discussing and arguing, is there even any digital policy issue to be sorted out? We spent like 2 years just arguing whether there is anything to be sorted out as well. But there was basically stonewalling being done. And that has continued in WSIS +10, World Summit +10, which happened in 2015. And now as +20 comes, which is in 2025, we have started parallel things which start getting organized to kind of become a foil to the possibilities of developing countries, again, raising the issues. The developing countries raise the issue at 20 +10 also, and nothing got sorted out. And again, that issue will come that from the World Summit, there is a mandate that there should be a global governance body. There has to be a WHO of digital policies. That's the only way you can understand it. It's very funny and strange that education, which is not that global if you look at it, has a UNESCO. Health is global, but not that global if you really look at primary healthcare, has a WHO, and digital, which is inherently and congenitally global, does not have a global organization to mind it. So the most important thing required is to get past this multi-stakeholderism, which is good for technical governance, have a multilateral system where people can go and talk about these things. And the problem with the Digital Global Compact is trying to become a competing multi-stakeholder system, which tries to fill that gap and makes, therefore, multilateral bodies more difficult. We don't have a problem with multi-stakeholder systems, which discuss things, and we already have an IGF for that. And I think we should put together our energies. Everybody on the street even is calling for breaking up big tech, regulating big tech, and we can't regulate big tech by having big tech telling us how that regulation would be, which is multi-stakeholderism. And I'll stop here. Thanks.
Exactly. Thank you for that passionate answer, Parminder. And then you mentioned a lot of important issue about the need for the international level governance. You also mentioned about like how do we not like it's not the government shouldn't be in multi-stakeholderism. It needs to really look into the multilateral system and etc. And then I'm now just going to give it back once more to Ruth. And then I think that if we can actually have one question later on, and then the other speaker will wrap up because we are kind of short of time. Ruth, my last question to you.
Thank you, Rina. Yes, well, it's very interesting to hear Parminder talk about the massive picture, and I don't think I really hope that we do find out some way to bring it back to a multilateral stakeholder governance rather than, just in name. So, I mean, what can we do at the scale that we're working at to ensure this democratic access to the benefits of digitalization, and how do we retain that control and ownership benefits within the generators potentially of that digital tech? Because I think in many ways multilateral approaches can amplify good digital tech solutions. Say, a very concrete solution that we might potentially use in the food system. I don't think they can generate them. So the things that need to be generated by the farmer, by the user, whatever it is that the actor is doing, whether they're directly farmers or food producers or food distributors, that's where the useful tech that we can actually implement what we want to do with, and that can be amplified by other agents, but I think it really has to be useful and not to just be another product, as I was saying, and not just another product that gets sold back to us once our data has been harvested. Then we really need to find some way of retaining that ownership and that control, and the development comes through farmer to farmer networks. What is it? What is the solution that we're trying to, what are we trying to address? I'm just thinking of a particular example that I heard about some time ago, where a vineyard was collecting vast amounts of data on harvest records and temperatures, and an awful lot of time and resources went into collecting this data, and then it was stored, in this particular case, in the farm office. And nobody ever looked at it again. So, it's kind of this appropriate technology and doing that from the grassroots up. And of course, it may be amplified. It may become something that a lot of people use, but somehow we have to retain the development so that we're not just disempowered again as the people at the bottom of the system who are given things that we're considered to need. We actually need to have our voice in this situation where we say this is what we need, and also that we're allowed to say this is what we don't need, what we don't want. We don't want to be directed to use solutions or directed to use digitalization, which is not appropriate. Very few times have I stood in the middle of my farm or woken up at 4 o'clock in the morning worrying about a situation on my farm and thought, what I need here is more digitalization. It's not that, but so yeah, that many things can be resolved by digitalization, but we need to not over egg it. But yeah, we need to retain that control and that potential for ourselves, not have the value extracted from it. How do we do that?
Thank you so much, Ruth. And then you said regaining control, reclaiming our power. And then there's this actually question. And then we go to the question and answer. So what I'm going to do, I'm just going to sort of like try to read some of the questions, right? And then maybe, each of you can take which question that you want to take, or while you're doing your last remark on this session. So one question I think probably relevant for you, Ruth, is that there's also like when you mentioned about reclaiming, right, the control and power, how can we provide skill and technological digital awareness, right, to the marginalized communities so they can be transformed, and what kind of organizing works that we need to do? So that's one question that I have here. And then also another question that maybe any other panelists want to say is there's a question about the cryptocurrencies and the impact that they will have on the digital divide and inequalities, right? So this is also another question. And then I will just give it maybe to Ruth first, if that's okay, Ruth. So we're going to have it in that order. And then of course, you can also say your last remark in 1 minute about what you want to say for this session. Ruth, go ahead.
Yeah, well, in terms of what we need and from the bottom up, I think in order to access those communities or those individuals who are perhaps disempowered to use tech, either culturally or economically, then to my mind and my organization's mind, it would be a case of, again, this peer-to-peer, farmer-to-farmer learning. And when I say farmer, it could be anybody who's acting in the food system, is to find out what the needs are, to find out what the barriers are, and to address those rather than to do the kind of, oh, well, here we are with some very clever solutions to a problem of yours that we see. So we really need to engage with what is actually going on. And there may be barriers that we, perhaps with our more technological mindset, don't even conceive as a possible barrier. So we really need to go and ask these people, what is it? What are the barriers to you at the moment, and address those rather than coming in with a fancy app that we've developed for a problem that they don't actually have.
All right, thank you so much, Ruth. Now, Parminder.
Yeah, so there was a cryptocurrency question, and I've answered it in the question answers, but I can answer it here. The only purpose of cryptocurrency is to get governments out of currency management, which is to push them out of economic management and the redistributive role that economic management could provide, and currency controls. That's the only purpose. Even those who promote it make it very clear that government can use currency systems to redistribute, and the elite wants to protect themselves against the redistributive potential. So that's all cryptocurrencies are about. And while I'm at the question, there is an important governance issue here in the whole blockchain thing. A lot of people will come to you and tell you, yeah, we recognize that digital power is concentrated, but yes, I now know that blockchain is going to deconcentrate it. And then I have to remind them that, excuse me, 20 years back, you came and said, internet is going to redistribute power all over and take the power to the peripheries. And this is what internet has done after 20 years. And now blockchain, you say, is going to do that. It's not that technologies do anything, institutions do it. And we have to keep on taking recourse to institutions which can use technology, but technology is trying to replace institution is the original problem. And that same thing the cryptocurrency thing is trying to do.
Thank you, Parminder. Soledad?
I kind of like what just Parminder said, that technologies don't do anything. It's institutions that actually do it. I would add that it's institutions and people. I think that there's two things that it's worth pointing out. One is that in terms of understanding how to govern this issue of digital, we have to really confront these very homogeneous narratives that have become present as a valid truth that has no sustained. For example, the idea that the problem with food systems is that we don't have enough data. We have a long list of problems with food systems that has nothing to do with data and that we have known for 20, 30 years. But suddenly there's a shift in the narrative that makes everything that is important has to do with developing digital technologies and hoarding data. And this is something that happens, I think, in every sector right now. And we should stop for a moment and ask ourselves if we are finding a solution that hasn't been presented with a problem before. And this is very important. There's a big issue towards what narrative is being presented to us. And in that sense, I think that people's power to engage in the discussion, it is very important, as well as people's power to find the adequate technology to figure out the solutions to the problem. Not necessarily saying it has to be digital or not digital. It's not a Luddite concern in this sense, but a problem of who defines the problem that needs to be addressed. And I see there's a lot of examples of farmers organizations, of open source organizations developing technology. In the UK, where Ruth is, there's a good experience of farm hacking and collectives in the rural areas developing the adequate technologies. That happens all around the world. And as I mentioned before, there is this possibility of actually civil society self-organizing to address the problem on how a technology can, in long term, get involved in our lives. No? So the idea of tech assessment as something that is reliable in terms of what is the future that we want, and how should evaluate if a technology is useful or not to our desired futures. It's to food sovereignty, for democracy, for transparency and less corruption, whatever we think, it's a tool that we do have. So I would engage again in the idea that there's a possibility to self-organize and develop strategies for governance from the bottom up.
Amazing, Soledad. Thank you so much for adding that on the power of the people. And now I'm going to give it to Clovis.
Oh, thank you. I think just to conclude, what I get from this discussion, it's a lot of examples of how this technological change is coming so fast that has been quite almost imposed to us in developing countries. And not only that, but how the concentration of wealth of these platforms that was already created before, when this technological revolution was really playing out in developed countries, is already coming. So when it comes to developing countries, that is already all done there. So it's clear that when it comes to developing countries, this change comes very fast and very abrupt. So society doesn't have the time, and the government and civil society to really catch up with that. The thing is that the only way, clear way, there are many ways to mitigate these effects and try to minimize the risk, but the only way to turn the table on that is if developing countries really use these technological change to catch up and to move ahead. And the periods that few experience of countries that were able to catch up economically and technologically were at the beginning of previous technological revolutions. In the 80s, Asian countries, early last century with US and German catching up with UK. So it's important that we take this opportunity now to use this revolution not only to suffer the effect, but really surf this wave on our own terms and catch these opportunities ourselves.
Thank you so much for that, Clovis. And then I think that we are already at the end of our event. And then this has been like a great discussion so far. I listened to all the speaker, and then we also that provided their insights and then also their proposal on what governance look like. I'm just going to give like some last remarks that why we are actually having this, and then also we want to have this discussion to really show, you know, that amidst all this effort at the global and the national level, there's remain a huge vacuum in the governance of digital technologies that needs to be addressed with a very with a true sense of urgency, yeah, to assert the mandate of inclusive multilateral institution over corporate interests and to protect human rights. We listen from our speakers about the issue of power and then how the people needs to reclaim the power. We also say that the governance of digitalization is really key in curbing the widening digital divide and contribute towards the vision of the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development, and then to really leave no one behind. And then it cannot be done in the multi-stakeholderism approach. We support multilateralism, but we're going to actually ensure that multilateralism that we have is actually the one that really reduces inequalities of wealth, power, and resources, and underpinned by the key principles in accordance with the state responsibility to respect, protect, and fulfill human rights and gender equality. So I'm going to stop for that, and then thank you so much for attending, and then all the speakers for your amazing contribution. Thank you, everyone, and then good evening, and then good morning, and then good afternoon.